Scary movies are supposed to, well, scare people. But how much is too much? These horror films found out when they crossed the line and then walked it back.
What was Sigourney Weaver's one no-no on the Nostromo? If Weaver hadn't put her foot down, there might have been more than aliens bumping around in the dark. By the time the credits rolled on 1986's Aliens, Ellen Ripley had been firmly established as the de facto face of the franchise and the most badass sci-fi lead of all time.
Get away from her, you.
But that wasn't always the plan. In fact, one of the wildest things about the Alien franchise is just how much of its success seems to have come about by improvisation. In the original script for 1979's Alien, her character wasn't even supposed to be a woman. Even after Ripley's gender was flipped, the decision to let her survive had little to do with feminism or making Ripley into a franchise lead. Weaver said in a 2006 interview with Total Film, "No one on that film was a feminist. Everyone thought, who will ever think the woman is going to be the survivor? So it was just one big gag." Weaver echoed those comments during a 2022 interview with Mark Maron for his WTF podcast. As the writers saw it, everyone would have expected someone like John Hurt's character to make it to the end, so they tried to subvert that expectation.
We'll just make the girl the survivor, because no one in their wildest dreams will think it's going to end up being the girl.
That kind of thinking illustrates just how much rewriting and recutting happened throughout production. At one point, there was even a sex scene in the script between Ripley and Captain Dallas. According to Roger Luckhurst's book on Alien, the point of it was to give them a brief moment of relief after Kane's gory death, but Weaver herself wasn't impressed by it. As she recounted to Maron, from a story perspective, she didn't think the sex scene made any sense, and she told Ridley Scott that during their first meeting.
I don't know about this love scene. Would you really get it on while this thing was running? Anyway, we had a good talk.
Although the scene was reportedly one of Scott's favorites, he eventually cut it. There are a lot of explanations for why cutting the sex scene made for a wise decision, but the main result is that Ripley really does feel like a character whose gender is essentially irrelevant to the story. She starts the movie off as third in command, and it's only after Dallas's death that she rises as the main authority figure in the group. In the version of the movie we got, the apparent affection we get from Ripley and Dallas can also simply be explained as platonic respect, nothing more. One potential downside to cutting the scene, however, is just that it takes away another opportunity for us to get to know the characters better before the xenomorph kills off 90% of them. Alien is a great movie with a fun, atmospheric plot, but one side effect of the bold dwindling of its cast is that most of the characters don't stick out as much as they probably should have. Is Dallas or Kane really anyone's favorite Alien character? They get a few good character-building moments for fans to pick up on during rewatches, but for casual viewers, they're both gone too soon to properly make an impression. Dallas didn't need a sex scene with Ripley to have a bigger impact on the franchise, but an extra scene or two of him before his death would have gone a long way. That said, we can't complain too much, because Weaver was right. A scene with those two bumping uglies wasn't at all necessary to the plot. And in the end, the only character who really mattered was the one originally set up to be, in her words, one big gag.
This is Ripley, last survivor of the Nostromo. Signing off.
How could a film about a cocaine-raging bear possibly go too far with a death scene? And what other experiences with bears has the actor portraying Olaf had? Keep watching to find out. Cocaine Bear is a bit of a strange movie, but you probably expected that going in. The film certainly does get gleefully violent at times, something that arguably gets hampered due to its uses of CGI in combination with practical effects. But whether you love Cokie the Bear or not, you can still walk away appreciating how a mid-budget studio feature can get away with the types of kills featured here. One of the most intriguing was the sudden and off-screen death of Olaf, a tourist who loses his fiancée Elsa to the bear at the start of the movie, and returns at the end only to be killed off himself. Towards the end of the film, we hear Olaf scream, and find out a few minutes later that he was mauled to death. It's hard to make out any details since the cutaway is very quick and obscured in darkness, and according to director Elizabeth Banks, that's for a good reason. Olaf's death was apparently a little too gruesome. Banks told Entertainment Weekly, "We had some incredible prosthetics of him. They ripped off his whole face, and we had a close-up of it that is no longer in the movie. Maybe in the director's cut we'll get some of that back in." While it's unclear whether an unrated cut of Cocaine Bear will ever surface, you can see some of the extreme gore that Banks teased. Fangoria included an uncensored photo of the Olaf prosthetics on the cover of their latest issue. Though it doesn't get center stage on the cover, we get to see just what the bear did to that poor hiker, and man, is it gnarly. How do we know for certain that this is the corpse that was cut from the movie? The answer is Olaf's red bandana, which the hiker sports throughout the film. Surprisingly, Olaf's mauling might not have been cut due to studio or MPAA interference. As Banks suggests in the Entertainment Weekly interview, these cuts may have been made to simply improve the story. She explained, "At the very end of the process, we ended up cutting back on a few shots of gore in the third act of the film. I just felt at that point the audience was on more of an emotional journey, and I didn't want to distract from it." That's not to say that Cocaine Bear is free of gory deaths. There are plenty that were left in. Esteemed character actress Margot Martindale gets mauled a couple of times by the bear before finally coming to a brutal end when she's thrown out of the back of an ambulance while strapped to a gurney and hits the road face first. Meanwhile, the late great Ray Liotta plays a drug dealer called Sid who gets disemboweled and dies watching some coked-up bear cubs eating his intestines. The scene is both disgusting and oddly adorable. Christopher Havieu is best known for his role as Tormund Giantsbane in Game of Thrones, who had considerably better luck than Olaf, both in general and specifically with bears. In Season 4, Tormund brags that he once made love to a female bear called Sheila, and he has fond memories of their encounter. He recalls, "I'd had a good bit to drink. Her fangs were sharp, but she knew how to use them." There are no other witnesses to the supposed event, besides Sheila, of course, and Ygritte dismisses Tormund as a liar. But the tale of the bear and the wildling fair made a comeback when the cast were filming the Season 7 episode Beyond the Wall, in which Tormund and a group of other heroes run into a polar bear that's been raised from the dead by the White Walkers. Havieu revealed, "When we shot it, we joked a lot that Sheila had turned. There was a line that was cut. When they first see the bear, Tormund says, 'I've danced with plenty of bears.'" Tormund survived his encounter with the undead flaming polar bear, so he probably wouldn't have had any trouble with the cocaine bear. Like Sheila, Koki is a she-bear, so he could have just used his powers of seduction again. Unfortunately, while Olaf is definitely a nature-loving character, nature doesn't seem to love him back.
Barbarian is a horror movie that's making people squirm. But if things had gone a little differently, we would have all lost our lunch. Barbarian features a number of scenes best described as disturbing. Even if you haven't seen it yet, it's painfully obvious from the trailers alone that the movie was made to distress even the most stalwart of horror fans. That being said, writer-director Zach Kreger did decide to scrap one particularly gnarly scene that would have had loads of people in the audience audibly yelping and squirming in their seats. While it would have contributed greatly to the gross-out factor of Barbarian, it was a bridge too far that didn't need to be crossed.
You cannot get upset.
Those who have seen the film are familiar with the scene in which Justin Long's disgraced egomaniacal actor character AJ refuses to drink from the baby bottle from Mother. She then takes him and attempts to breastfeed him directly. That is already outrageous enough. But originally, that scene was meant to go in a slightly different direction. Mother was going to utilize a different tactic to feed AJ, and it didn't involve milk. There are other ways that mothers in nature feed their children. As humans, we are quite familiar with breastfeeding. But what about birds? Well, mother birds have a method of chewing up food for baby birds and depositing that food directly into their child's beak from their own. If you were to see a human being do this for another human being, you would be rightfully disgusted. Well, that's exactly what Mother was going to do to AJ in Barbarian. At a Q&A for the picture at Fright Fest, Zach Kreger detailed the moment, saying, "We cut a scene where he refuses to latch, and so she snatches up a rat, chews it up, and baby birds him. We filmed it perfectly. Justin was such a good sport. Matthew, who plays the mother, really masticated the prosciutto and dropped it direct, bullseye, into his mouth. It was pretty gross." In a film filled with moments designed to make you writhe around in discomfort, this scene would have ranked high, if not at the very top. Food regurgitation on its own is enough to whip an audience into a frenzy. But when that regurgitation goes into another person's mouth, that defies so many ideas of health and hygiene. You might be regurgitating yourself in the theater if you see something like that. However, Zach Kreger cut the scene. While this spares the audience from something gross, it also helps keep the tension and the unknown the top priorities.
Hello?
For as monstrous and seemingly otherworldly Mother is, she's still very much a human being, which the third act hammers home. This is a person born into an unimaginably horrific circumstance, a person who fundamentally does not understand how she is affecting the lives of the people who find themselves coming into that secret underground lair. Having her feed AJ as if she were a bird would completely break her humanity, and probably make audiences just get up and leave. Zach Cregger also said that he didn't want to oversaturate Barbarian with appearances from Mother. He took that lesson from Jaws, which is famous for how little it actually shows the killer shark that serves as the film's monster. He goes on to say in that Fright Fest Q&A, "We realized that it couldn't stay in the movie because you don't want to see the shark too much, and there's no way to show that without getting really up close. And it was just not appropriate yet, so it had to go." The more you see Matthew Patrick Davis covered head to toe in old woman prosthetics, the less likely you are to be scared of that character. At a certain point, it becomes silly. And you need the constant tension of Mother for Barbarian to be effective. Cutting the baby birding scene was absolutely the right move. The scene may have gotten a wild audience reaction and added to the film's mystique of being a crazy time in the theater, but dramatically speaking, it wouldn't have added much, and for some viewers, it probably would have been too much to swallow.
The original R-rated version of The Meg included a scene with a talking decapitated head, the thought of which would surely delight horror fans. So why did the director leave gory stuff like this out from the final cut? Here's what he had to say. "Bigger isn't always better, and gorier isn't always scarier." That's a discovery that director John Turteltaub made in the midst of directing the giant killer shark movie The Meg, starring Jason Statham. Originally intending The Meg to teeter the line between a hard PG-13 and a soft R-rated blood feast, there were a lot of chunks of flesh that ended up on the cutting room floor. From the jump, The Meg was always going to be refreshingly self-aware and not afraid to make fun of itself. Why else would you cast Statham, an action superstar who has never shied away from a knowing nod or wink to the camera? But to the dismay of horror fans looking for a hefty dose of bloodshed, The Meg left much to be desired as far as graphic violence was concerned when it hit theaters in August of 2018. The real reason why The Meg didn't have the certain quota of monster mayhem many expected came down to dollars and cents. That said, it was a stark financial reality that kept Turteltaub and crew from turning the film into a full-on gore fest. Turteltaub lamented the fact that they had to pull back on some of the flesh chomping, telling Bloody Disgusting, "We shot or even did a lot of visual effects for gory scenes. We just realized there's no way we're keeping this PG-13 if we show this. I was very hesitant to cut out a lot of blood and gore. I wouldn't have if I thought it was wrecking the story, but it wasn't. It still looked okay." One scene in particular that sounds like it would have been an instant crowd pleaser ended up raising too many eyebrows for being overly ghastly. Turteltaub told the outlet, "There was a death in the movie of one of the leading characters where you thought he was still alive, and you realized it was only his head. Then the reveal that that was all that was left was awesome. But needless to say, quite a few people told us it was creepy and I had to cut it." Now with Meg 2: The Trench, the PG-13 formula that the original took advantage of is obviously paying off.
That's the biggest Meg I've ever seen.
Biggest Meg anyone's ever seen.
The trailer shows Jason Statham fighting 3 more giant sharks, in addition to the visual of a megalodon eating a T-Rex. Meg 2 is clearly going more in the direction of Jurassic Park than Jaws, opting for spectacle over straight-up terror. The move to more mammal-on-dinosaur violence begs the question of whether or not the Meg or the Meg 2 ever needed an R rating in the first place. There's a common misconception that a film like The Meg is beholden to the rating system dictated by the MPA, but that's not really the case. The Meg and its sequel were already intended to be PG-13 from the start, with little wiggle room to work with. That, coupled with the fact that the effects work needed to render more graphic kill scenes is just too pricey to justify, means that an R-rated cut of either film will never see the light of day. Since the age of physical media is coming to an end, there's simply no reason for a studio to invest more money to make an already successful PG-13 blockbuster into an R-rated feature. Turteltaub told Bloody Disgusting back in 2018, "The problem nowadays with those unrated DVDs is you used to have a bunch of scenes that were easy to either shoot or leave on the cutting room floor. Now, to finish a scene costs millions in VFX. No one's going to be spending millions of dollars just to have a little extra bonus footage."
There's nothing like an old-fashioned tale of technology running amok, and 2022's Megan definitely scratches, or rather, slashes that itch. But if the horror flick's brand of biting social commentary and brutal kills weren't enough for you, well, there's always the unrated version. If you thought the PG-13 version of Megan was mouthy, you might want to cover your ears for the unrated cuts. Shortly after the surprisingly touching horror comedy hit theaters, director Gerard Johnstone and screenwriter Akela Cooper both made it known that the original script was gorier than what was shown in theaters and teased the possibility of an unrated cut, as much of the original gore was already filmed but edited out for a PG-13 release. Luckily, Blumhouse and Universal Pictures made the brilliant decision to release the gorier cut of Megan, which is now available to stream.
Holy shit, this is exciting.
PG-13 movies are allocated a single F-bomb, and the theatrical release of Megan really made it count. Rather than letting Megan, or even a terrified Allison Williams, drop the ultimate swear, the honor was instead given to the incel in training, Brandon, the awful preteen bully that triggers Megan's killing spree. In the unrated cut, there are 8 F-bombs dropped. Brandon still gets his time in the sweary son, but Gemma's boss David is the source of 6 more. Don't get us wrong, his whole vibe was hugely effective in the theatrical cut, but giving him the chance to pop off some more expletives really hammers home what a monstrous boss he can be. But the best F-bomb comes from Megan herself, as she lets one fly during her massive showdown during the film's climax. We're not going to spoil where exactly the F-bomb drops, because everyone deserves the chance to be able to throw their head back to cackle in delight when it happens. Just know that Megan's timing is always right. Some viewers were surprised by the lack of gore in the theatrical release of Megan, with many hoping for an unrated cut to really let the AI killer doll unleash unbridled chaos. Fortunately, those wishes were received, as the new cut really lets Megan go hard in the name of killing. The first major change deals with the death of Brandon. Megan still pulls off his ear after he bullies Katie and attacks Megan, but the footage of the ear rip is absolutely brutal. Megan could easily pull off his ear quickly, but she revels in his pain. She straight up mutilates this kid before chasing him down the hill, putting him in the direct path of being hit by a car. Megan means business, and it's almost shocking to see the film really go there and kill a kid with such ferocity.
You know what happens to bad boys that don't mind their manners? They grow up to be bad men.
When Megan finally has her face off with Gemma's neighbor, Celia, she attacks her with a power washer, nailing her directly in the face and shredding off her cheek flesh with the pressure of the hose. It's far more graphic than the cutaway scene in the theatrical release, and a disgustingly awesome use of special effects. For those concerned about whether or not the death of Dewey the dog is more graphic, take solace in knowing the scene is still implied off-screen. Even the unrated version was wise enough to not kill a dog before the audience's eyes. The instantly viral teaser trailer for Megan featured her dancing in a red hallway, which turned out to be the start of her reign of terror within the walls of the Funky Corporation. When she chases down David to kill him with the blade of an industrial paper cutter, the results are far more graphic than before. David's blood sprays all over his assistant Kurt in the elevator, which makes Megan's monologue explaining how she's going to frame him for all of the murders all the more terrifying.
Your boss despised you, your peers treated you with contempt, and so you decided to get revenge.
When she finally slices his throat, blood erupts like a geyser, spraying all over the back walls of the elevator. The moment is still pretty quick, like the theatrical cut, but that little bit of extra gore really elevates the scene. It's incredible to see what a difference just a second and a half of footage can make, but the unrated cut of Megan feels like the definitive version of who this character is and just what she's capable of.
A real-life crime that derailed an entire movie. Even the most intense horror movies have to draw the line somewhere. George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead is one of the greatest zombie movies ever made. Full of gory deaths, sick social commentary, and plenty of undead tension, the film continues to influence zombie cinema to this day. While Night of the Living Dead kindled the fire, Dawn of the Dead ignited it. In Dawn of the Dead, survivors of a zombie outbreak barricade themselves in a shopping mall, taking on both consumerism and the undead as they endeavor to survive for as long as possible. In the filmed ending, Peter and Fran successfully escape the mall by helicopter. As outlined by Little White Lies, Romero originally scripted a much darker conclusion that would have seen Peter taking his own life off-screen. Fran, now without hope, would have thrust her head into the helicopter's spinning blades. Speculatively, Romero was said to be so attached to the characters by the time they began to film the end that he couldn't in good conscience have them killed so brutally. Disparate accounts exist as to whether the ending was shot, though as it stands, Fran and Peter survive and fly off into an uncertain, zombie-filled future. The King Kong cinematic universe is no stranger to deleted scenes. Peter Jackson's 2005 revitalization of the iconic fantasy features a lengthy deleted scene that sees the core cast battling a monstrous, piranha-like creature in the rivers of Skull Island. The scene is available on YouTube, with close to finished audio and visuals, though the sequence was unfortunately excised from the theatrical cut. Perhaps most infamous, however, is the missing spider pit from Merian C. Cooper and Ernest B. Shosak's 1933 original. While Jackson would pay homage to the sequence almost a century later, the original scene remains the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. For the uninitiated, the original 1933 film had planned a spider pit sequence that would see Jack Driscoll and company falling into a pit of arachnoid creatures after King Kong shakes them from a log. In the release cut, the film seamlessly transitions to Jack's escape from the pit, with the other sailors presumably dying from the fall. The plan, however, was to have them devoured by spiders living at the bottom of the pit. Some speculate the scene was scrapped before filming, while others contend footage does exist, though it was scrapped after test audiences deemed it too brutal. Whether it exists or not, it's definitely interesting that, at some point, the 1933 Fay Wray masterpiece might well have been considerably more bloodthirsty. Slender Man certainly had its 15 minutes, but much like the creepypasta phenomenon itself, the ghoulish monster is a mid-aughts artifact, a digital specter of online urban legends and chat room spook shows. It would have made a lot of sense for studios to capitalize on the craze when Slender Man was in the zeitgeist, with web series like Marble Hornets and the Slender Game to propel its momentum. However, that didn't happen, and the Slender Man feature arrived too little, too late, with the added controversy of releasing in an environment where Slender Man was in the news for very different reasons. According to Bloody Disgusting, Screen Gems also radically reworked Slender Man. First, in order to gain a more teen-friendly tone, David Burke's screenplay was rewritten, scrapping any more mature content for more accessible PG-13 blood and gore. Compounding the problems was a real-life case of a Slender Man stabbing. Both Sony and Screen Gems opted to cut several key scenes, including a few glimpsed in Slender Man's trailer, to sidestep the controversy of ostensibly exploiting a real-life crime. As Bloody Disgusting contends, the combination of script changes and scene cuts results in a movie that doesn't feel much like a movie at all. Whatever Slender Man's legacy should have been, this is certainly not it. Horror movies are designed to push the boundaries of good taste, but sometimes skittish censors, lightheaded audiences, and flesh-eating predators force certain cuts to be made. In the 1986 version of The Fly, eccentric scientist Seth Brundle is applying the finishing touches to a pair of teleportation pods in his industrial apartment. One evening, after an argument with his new girlfriend Ronnie, a drunken Seth teleports himself on a whim and emerges unscathed. But he didn't notice the housefly in the pod's window. He gradually realizes that his DNA has been spliced with the insects, and soon enough, he gradually morphs into a hideous mutant hybrid creature. Directed by David Cronenberg, The Fly is a powerful story about love and disease that reached a mainstream audience without compromising Cronenberg's signature body horror style. In fact, it features some of the most grotesque imagery of his career, from rashes and abnormal body hair to exploding eyeballs and a ripped-off jaw. However, there was one scene that proved too much for test audiences. The scene eventually showed up on home video releases. It depicted an increasingly deformed Seth using the telepods to fuse a cat with a baboon, creating a monstrous entity that's one part feline and one part primate. Disgusted by what he's done, Seth struggles with the ferocious mutant before bludgeoning it to death with a metal pipe. There are two obvious problems with this scene. First, it's jarringly unsympathetic, even if Seth is losing his mind. Second, the animatronics fail to rise to the occasion, as the creature looks like a bit of a shag carpet.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival on September 24, 1986, almost 2 months after the 6th installment of the Friday the 13th series. Moviegoers at the time could have been forgiven for seeing it as just another slasher film, but Henry actually had little in common with Friday the 13th, or any other schlocky franchise for that matter. As director John McNaughton explained in a 1999 interview, our chief device was removing fantasy, because as long as you have the buffer of fantasy, then you have a level of comfort and distance. Indeed, there's certainly no comfort or distance in Henry, as it features scenes of sexual assault, torture, and murder in a cold and realist style. One could argue that this is an appropriate manner of depiction compared to its more frivolous slasher contemporaries, but the censors had other concerns. The British Board of Film Classification cut 62 seconds from the theatrical release, and a further 51 seconds for the video release. 4 seconds were cut from a stabbing scene, 38 seconds from a bloody aftermath involving a bottle in a woman's face, and 71 seconds from a disturbing home invasion.
Where are we gonna go now?
We'll find a place.
French filmmaker Alexandre Aja had to cut 10 seconds of violence from his 2008 film Mirrors to secure an R rating from the Motion Picture Association of America. Later in Britain, the BBFC gave the film an 18 rating, owing to its strong gory content. 20th Century Fox wanted a more commercial 15 rating, so they agreed to cuts in 4 instances. The first cuts were made to a scene in which a security guard slits his own throat with a glass shard, causing blood to spray from the deep wound. Then there was the sight of a horrifically burned woman screaming in pain. Cuts also came to perhaps the film's goriest moment, in which a woman's mouth is torn apart in grotesque detail. Finally, frames were removed from another throat-slashing scene towards the end of the film. These cuts pertain only to the theatrical version, as Mirrors was ultimately uncut for its home video releases. Legendary film critic Roger Ebert had a memorably strong reaction to the first Wolf Creek movie back in 2005. As he put it, "What the hell is the purpose of this sadistic celebration of pain and cruelty? If anyone you know says this is the one they want to see, my advice is, don't know that person no more." A majority of critics struck a similar tone, but that didn't stop the eventual release of a sequel, as Wolf Creek 2 delivered another 100+ minutes of Australian outback brutality. The Australian Classification Board gave Wolf Creek 2 an R18+ rating, meaning that no one below the age of 18 could view it in theaters. As the board explained in their decision, it is episodic and realistic, resulting in copious, realistic blood and gore effects, and includes decapitation and dismemberment.
People like me eat people like you for breakfast.
The movie's distributor, Roadshow Films, wasn't satisfied with this appraisal, but what did they expect? Wolf Creek 2 revels in the destruction of human anatomy and the many ways in which it can be done. Australian horror fans surely would have cried foul if it had received anything less. But according to screenwriter Aaron Stearns, the distributors were looking for an audience wider than just the most hardcore horror enthusiasts. So several cuts were made to a revolting headshot, a decapitation, a full body dismemberment, and bloody wounds to one character's face and another's fingers. The 2003 version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was never outright banned like the 1974 original, but the Motion Picture Association of America did request 2 cuts to avoid an NC-17 rating. First was a suicide by gunshot, as director Marcus Nispel had to reduce the blood and remove the side of a severed ear. He claimed that he was satisfied with this shot despite the cut. As he put it, "In the actual cut, the blood is less red, which I think is actually much scarier in a way. I like that it's dark, and I never like blood that looks like syrup or ketchup or whatever." However, Nispel was less enthusiastic about the cuts to a scene in which the villain Leatherface hangs a victim from a dusty old chandelier, pulls the cord of his chainsaw, and cuts him in half from the groin upwards. The censors took their mop and bucket to this scene, removing all the mess and leaving Leatherface's terrible act to viewers' imaginations. As Nispel put it, 2 shots had to go out, which really don't show you all that much, but somehow it leaves me wondering what had really happened to him by removing them. Released in 1987, the original Hellraiser combined sex with violence in a way that troubled the ratings board. As writer-director Clive Barker recalled, "We did a version which had some spanking in it, and the MPAA was not very appreciative of that. They also told me I was allowed 2 consecutive buttock thrusts, but a third would be deemed obscene."
Go to hell!
Cuts were also made to a murder scene with a hammer, as the number of strikes were reduced, much like the buttock thrusts. Also left out were images of one character's hand in an open, bloody abdomen. Barker's most regretful cut occurred during the finale, in which the character of Frank is torn apart by hooks and chains, as the ratings board took issue with how Frank licked his lips in an odd, masochistic manner. As Barker explained, "It was a much longer shot. Body pieces went every place. In another life, I would have let that run slightly longer, as it looked slightly truncated." Mystery surrounds a scene involving a bloody piranha attack in the 1980 found footage film Cannibal Holocaust. The moment was set to depict tribesmen tying an enemy to a log and lowering him into a piranha-infested river, stripping everything below the waterline to the bone. A still of this scene was used to market the film, but the full sequence proved to be elusive. In 2021, Dread Central spoke to Callum Waddle, author of the book Cannibal Holocaust: Devil's Advocates. Waddle quoted Colombian actor Ronaldo Blanca, who said, "I was there for that scene. Director Ruggero Deodato definitely shot it. He called action and he called cut, and some of us had gathered around to watch it and we all applauded. It was a brilliant effect." This isn't the only moment that was cut from Cannibal Holocaust. The film was so shocking that Italian authorities arrested Deodato for the murder of his actors, an accusation he disproved by inviting the very much alive cast to court. The movie was banned in 40 countries and remains prohibited or censored to this day, primarily because of its scenes of real animal slaughter. Gory cult favorite Event Horizon was almost even gorier than what was shown in theaters. The original cut ran over 2 hours long, thanks in part to reels of bloody imagery that were so visceral that some test audience members fainted. as director Paul W.S. Anderson admitted on the DVD commentary.
I was just enjoying the gruesomeness of it so much, I just probably put way too much in that.
According to the film's effects supervisor, Anderson's early cut gave a more detailed account of the Event Horizon massacre, as it featured graphic mutilation of teeth, legs, and breasts. As Anderson also noted in the commentary track, you can't underestimate the kind of shock this movie had. People were really upset by it. If we'd had more time to work on it, we could have kept a lot of the more gruesome aspects. Ultimately, the Event Horizon that reached theaters was a much shorter 96-minute version that passed the ratings board's approval without incident. The first Paranormal Activity ends with a demon-possessed Katie hurling her boyfriend Mika at the camera, but this wasn't the only possible conclusion. In fact, director Oren Peli weighed up 3 other endings, and 2 of them were quite brutal. In the least violent one, a neighbor calls the cops, who arrive at the house and corner the possessed Katie. Their presence appears to sober her, but then a sudden door slam startles a cop who shoots her dead. The other 2 endings are even more unsettling. Technical concerns stop Peli from filming a scene in which Katie takes the camera and bludgeons Mika to death in a point-of-view style. It's hard to know whether audiences would have laughed or screamed at that. However, Peli fully understood the intense reaction to the conclusion in which Katie kills Mika downstairs, then enters the bedroom and slits her throat in front of the camera. He chose the ending shown in theaters based in part on Steven Spielberg's suggestion.